Michael Pack worked behind enemy lines for years. The documentary filmmaker behind Created Equal, Clarence Thomas, in his own words, spent decades at PBS. Yeah, that PBS. Now, Pack's films weren't overtly conservative, but they were more right-leaning than your average PBS joint. Created Equal alone let Justice Thomas speak his mind, something no mainstream filmmaker would let happen, ever. Can you imagine it? I can't. So when Pack branched out with Palladium Pictures, a new venture, it caught my attention. But better yet, he wrote a real clear politics op-ed on conservatives and the culture wars. It is a great column, this year's must-read essay. Here's an excerpt from You Can't Fight the Culture War Without Making Movies. The left owns the narrative. Their version of contemporary events and history dominates. We are told that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. The Cold War was ended thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev. Transgender athletes have a civil right to compete in sports with biological women, and the rest of the woke litany. Here's one more excerpt. America may be in a culture war, but only one side is fighting. The progressive left is making culture. We, on the conservative right, merely complain about it. Imagine a war where one side deploys troops and weapons, and the other side complains about the first group's inhumane behavior. No wonder we're losing. We haven't really begun to fight to get our troops into the field. It's gold, Jerry, but you got to read the whole piece, but after you hear my conversation with Michael and his son Thomas. The two spoke to the Hitcast about the new venture, why conservatives face such huge obstacles in the culture wars, and a lot more. Now, Thomas is in charge of this group's incubator program. It's teaching tomorrow's right-leaning artists today. And for anyone who scoffs at that idea, well, why do we need right-leaning films and TV shows anyway? The stuff out there is good enough. Well, just remember how much we're supposed to crave diversity, right? What about diversity of thought? Doesn't that matter? But honestly, the bigger picture here is clear. Right-leaning artists are going to tell you stories the left won't touch. Stories that matter. Stories that open up hearts and minds. Stories that should be told, but never will. Not without culture warriors like Michael and Thomas Pack. So pleased to have them on the show. And let me tell you, if you're an artist, if you're a consumer, take some notes. They've got something to share that's really important, and they're putting troops on the battlefield at long last. Michael, Thomas, thank you for joining the show. You know, obviously I read that op-ed and I couldn't wait to speak to both of you. Let's start where we should start, Palladium Pictures. Define it for the listener, how it's different than maybe some of the work you've done in the past. And obviously it's much different than other companies around Hollywood. So give us the thumbnail sketch and we'll get deeper from there.
Well, as you know, Christian, I've been a documentary producer for many years, many decades, through a company called Manifold Productions, which I started in 1977. But I have decided to launch Palladium Pictures to expand the kind of work that we do. And not only to make one documentary at a time, but to try to produce more documentaries and train the next generation of documentary filmmakers. So we launched Palladium Pictures, 6 months or so ago, but our website just went live now. And we're hoping to change the documentary landscape. As you know, and as I point out in my Real Clear article, the documentary landscape is dominated by the left. Not a healthy thing in a democracy.
In part because the stories that could be covered, should be covered, must be explored, aren't being explored for that reason.
Well, that's right. I always give the example of our last film, which, as you know, was Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words, where we had Clarence Thomas look directly at the camera and tell his life story from growing up in the segregated South to the Supreme Court, in his own words, in a compelling way, with stock footage and stills and recreations, but in his own words. But we are the only ones to do a documentary on Clarence Thomas. We have 4 or 5 films about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. One very successful documentary that was nominated for an Oscar. Ruth went to Sundance and was the toast of Sundance. Robert Redford welcomed her. It's inconceivable that he would welcome Clarence Thomas. But I think America needs to hear both kinds of stories, and it's only hearing one side, and that is contributing to the very distorted picture of the world that many Americans get. especially those that are locked in their own bubble. And so our goal has always been from the beginning, even at Manifold Productions, to speak to the middle of the country, not just the extremes. On the right, we do a pretty good job of preaching to the choir. There are some documentaries and short videos that do a good job of having our writers and critics and thinkers express their views and make their case, and that's fine. But there's a vast middle of the country that really needs to hear both sides and assess them. And that's really where the battle for America is, in my opinion.
One of the things you're working on, which sounds really important, is an incubator program, because as you mentioned in the article, there's a whole ecosystem that develops and supports and nurtures left-leaning storytellers. And there's nothing like that on the right. So tell me a little bit about that process, that program, and what it can do and what its plans are.
I'll give you the introduction, but then I want to hand it over to my son, Thomas,
Sure.
who's actually the incubator. Well, as you say, and as I point out in the article, there is a vast network on the left to encourage, develop, and nurture left-leaning, progressive documentary filmmakers, starting in film school. There are 4,000 or so universities in America, colleges and universities. They all have film schools. Each of them graduate, 50 to 100 each year, and they're all almost explicitly progressive. They want to train activists, is sometimes how they put it. So every year, there are 40 to 400,000 of these people loosed on the world, and if only 5 or 10% of them have talent, that's a vast pool. And it's a sifting process. We have nothing except the ones that rebel against that process. But after film school, there are many places they could go. There are workshops, there are training programs. Sundance, which we mentioned earlier, has the Sundance Workshop. There's one famous one in Maine. They're everywhere. And then PBS and other places have further things and encourage places for the aspiring filmmaker to get their first film shown. And then there's, beyond that, then there's the film festivals that are explicitly progressive. We mentioned Sundance, but, Telluride, Toronto, all of them. So there's nothing on the right. And so one of the reasons you only hear one side of the story is we just have a small talent pool. The left has invested in it. I say that they spend at least tens of billions a year every year for the last 40 years. We spend tens of millions, 1,000 times less over 40 or 50 years. So, including, Netflix itself just spends like 8 billion on content, maybe half is progressive. Public broadcasting is 2.5 billion. It's easy to get to 10. We have only tens of millions. We have to make a difference. We have to start developing and nurturing our talent. So to do our part, we want to start an incubator to train right of center, libertarian, conservative, maybe just questioning filmmakers. So I couldn't think of anyone better to run it than my son, Thomas, who not only knows something about film, having grown up with it, being forced to work on all my films in his childhood, but also he has a graduate degree in Penn in educational entrepreneurship. It's been in the education space, working in places like ISI and other nonprofits, running their education programs. So he is not a filmmaker, but he is running this program as a program. And let me ask him to speak about that.
Yeah.
Sure.
We learned from the best, by the way.
I did. I think that's, my father's right. So it came from an education space. I think one thing that's interesting about the education space is, conservatives are aware of the problem there in a pretty major way. I mean, there's some at every level, there's some kind of conservative institution that is trying to do something to make a difference on education, because not necessarily just because of our kids, but because of all, people just sort of understand the impact of education on culture. People understand the impact of film on culture too, but it doesn't show up in the same way. I mean, there isn't a counter ecosystem at all. And I think, the left is to be commended by the ecosystem that you describe here, of just like, the amount of nurturing and funding and, finding talent and cultivating that talent. I think it's impressive. And it leads to good and creative movies. I mean, it leads to great filmmakers being, coming through that system. I think it's an impressive thing. And there's no reason that why we shouldn't have something similar from our side. I mean, at this point, that you don't have to say Sundance is a left-leaning festival. It's just a festival, and festivals are all they all have their own perspective. I think it's important to build out this infrastructure. I think we kind of reject the premise that conservatives lack talent and therefore it's not worth this investment. I think there are talented conservatives. They're just not being nurtured in the same way.
Right.
The incubator.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the incubator program is for people that want to create a short documentary film. So we provide full funding for it, and it's that sort of first step in a career.
Sure. No, I've spoken to people like Kevin Sorbo and Nick Searcy, and they've been trying to do more than just act. They're trying to produce. They're trying to get new stories off the ground, and they're running into one brick wall after another, which I know that you both will understand quite well. This is the cold water question, because you both know that the powers that be who are wealthy and influential on the right, they just don't open their wallets like they could or should, like people on the left do. How do we change that? Is it even possible at this point? Because I think that's one of the biggest sticking points. You guys can do all the processing and all the gathering of talent as possible, but if there's not more money flowing, then these things, there's a limited shelf life here.
I agree with you. And I think we really have to persuade conservative right-leaning institutions to put up some money, more than the tens of millions. At least we've got to be 10 to 1 with the left, not 1,000 to 1. And the left has a vast pool. I mean, all their foundations, the Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, huge foundations. Plus, there are companies in LA that are explicitly looking for progressive films like Participant. And to say nothing of these whole networks that are essentially woke or have a woke side, like Netflix, like Amazon. So I don't want to be discouraging, because I always say that we can win the culture war. I was in government, as you know, Christian. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to change the government. The civil service is deeply dug in. They are just as woke as Hollywood filmmakers, but they are hard to change. Whereas culture is a free market. We can develop these institutions. We could do what the left has done. We could make the investment. We can have an impact. So one of the things, I salute these people that you mentioned in Hollywood that are trying to make feature films. And I would love to make feature films. That began my career with that aspiration. But I think that's a tougher nut to crack. It's bigger money. It's more complex distribution. It's harder to start. That is why we're in documentaries. And that's actually why I've been in documentaries all my life. I've made 15, and I've had total editorial control, and I'm proud of all 15. We can get these young filmmakers going. And there are people, and mostly the people who graduate from film school have to go into nonfiction. There's only so many jobs in Hollywood, mm-hmm. Whereas every website needs a video component. Every corporation has a video department. So it's really nonfiction that's the growth area, and that's easier entry. So we are hoping to find people who maybe have worked at a conservative organization making their videos that have some talent that actually want to be creative. And we are very optimistic, Christian, that we can get them distributed. There are way more avenues for distribution than before, and especially since we're focused on short videos in the incubator, 10 to 15-minute videos, we think we can place them. So Thomas began by saying what we offer these filmmakers, but that's one way maybe to look at how we think we can succeed. Right. Maybe you want to talk about that, Thomas.
Well, in a second, but one thing I was going to add to what you just said is, there's a great tradition on the right of, supporting the arts, being great patrons of the arts. I mean, I think it's something that conservatives intuitively do understand. Mm-hmm. We just have sort of created a bit of a environment now that points people that are interested in film toward quick hits and the types of films that are not directly addressing the culture in the long term. So I think that the way to make a difference is to show the sort of conservative donor class that great stuff can come. And mm-hmm. I think that the idea that good films impact the culture is intuitive, and people understand the value of investing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing someone mentioned before, the word questioning, not right necessarily, but questioning artists, someone who is willing to shake things up. And I think in the last few weeks you've seen things like Sound of Freedom, Richmond, North of Richmond, Try That in a Small Town. Rapper Tom McDonald's work is very counterculture. And I don't think you can say these are all conservative pieces of art at all. But they are questioning, they are different, they are challenging the norms, and they've all been wildly successful. Is this an aberration, or do you think that the work you're doing and the work you're trying to sponsor can piggyback on this cultural moment?
I agree with you, Christian, that those are very important signs of a trend. I think a huge percentage of the country does not feel its values are reflected in Hollywood movies and Hollywood produced television. And those are good examples of it. People are just anti-woke. I mean, isn't maybe another way to put it, rather than conservative. And they've had it with what some of those people may think of as elite culture. So we have to reflect that. So I think there is a hunger, and it proves there's an appetite for it. Sound of Freedom is a perfect example. What did they make, like $200 million, with this relatively low budget up against Hollywood movies? If that can be done, it proves there's a market for it. Mm-hmm. And I have to reach that market. I mean, it does, in the long run, the bigger battle, it takes a vast amount of money and a vast talent pool. We actually feel we at least have to get started somewhere and it's train some group. I'm always disconcerted that on the right, there are really hardly any documentary filmmakers that are making documentaries that appeal to the middle, that could be on PBS, that are at a high level, I feel that we do. I don't think that's a hard target to reach, because on the left, I'd say there are at least 30 such people, or maybe more. We need at least a few, and I think they would find an audience, and they might even find, we have been on PBS. I believe you could even get those kinds of documentaries on Netflix and Amazon and other streaming services. It can be done. I remember I was a senior executive at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I was a senior VP of programming from 2003 to 2006. And part of my mission was to find right of center filmmakers. And there were very few of them then. And PBS said to me, we won't air them unless they meet our quality standards. And I thought that was perfectly reasonable. Mm-hmm. And they pointed out that so few of them did. And and they were right. So we have to, it's now 20 years later, a whole new talent pool has emerged. There's a whole bunch of new technologies that's allowed these people to be trained. I think they're sort of findable. And I'm actually counting on Thomas to find them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Their website went live, what was that, like a week ago?
Yeah.
So I appeal to all your listeners either to apply if they're qualified or find someone to apply. We are going to we're going to fully fund 3 or 4 10 to 15 minute short documentaries, and we will distribute them. It's not going to be a grant. We're going to own them and executive produce them, but they will be able to fulfill their vision. And it's pretty simple to apply if they just go to our website, palladiumpictures.com. But to apply, they can't be in the middle of film school. They have to have done something to prove their talent. Mm-hmm. They have to have an idea where they have some hook to it. They have to have access or stock footage or something. And then they need to apply, and we hope to get lots of applications. We're going to fully fund 3 or 4 of them. We'll bring them to Washington for an opening event, but we'll go back and forth to these people, and we hope through that process, it's not going to be a training program where they do nothing. They're going to learn by making a film, and a good film. So I think, and we're going to do it every year. I mean, one of the problems on the conservative side has been a lack of long-term commitment, in addition to lack of funding. We're going to do it every year. And I hope, and over time, I think a class of these people will emerge. Thomas and I both worked at institutions like the Claremont Institute and the ISI that have yearly programs that develop an alumni network. We hope there will be an alumni network, that these people become a community and sort of help each other, and that the quality level goes up and up and up. But it has to start by getting your listeners either apply or get their sons or nephews or friends who actually are qualified to apply.
Sure, sure. In recent months, the Daily Wire's gone Hollywood. Blaze Media has been inching in that direction. Fox Nation has produced some comedy specials you wouldn't see on other platforms. I know you want to be generous to all of the above. I do too, but I'm kind of curious, what do you think they're doing right or wrong at this point? Is there anything you can share about, from your perspective? You've got such a unique angle on these things. You've been in this fight for so long and you're a creator for so long. Any comments about that?
Well, many of the people who work in those organizations are personal friends, long-term friends of mine. So I want to be nice to them.
Sure. Or maybe even just point out what they're doing right specifically, because then maybe that's something that could be replicated.
But I believe that we need a huge number more of such people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I salute every media effort that's making films and television, period, no matter what, that's right of center. I do believe that a lot of them, the ones you listed, hit this niche that I identified earlier, sort of preaching to the choir. And that's because that's where their audience and that's where their return on investment is. I mean, some of them are tied to already conservative podcasts and conservative commentators. They are generating revenue and audience and money by appealing to that audience. I think that's fine. I mean, if you take What is a Woman, I think a very clever documentary by the Daily Wire, I think it's not really appealing to people who want to understand what's going on in transgender. It's funny for those of us that kind of share his view, and I do share his view. And I salute those efforts, Christian. I would think we even need more of such efforts.
Mm-hmm.
We are in, I think, an entirely different business, just a different business. We are trying to make documentaries that tell stories that do not push an agenda, that let viewers decide. I've done that my entire career, and that's why my films have all been on PBS, not a right-wing media outlet. And that's what I want these films to do. The story tells itself. Clarence Thomas's story, you can listen to his story and decide. The story is the story. His life story is the life story. And we have done that, for instance, in our documentary about George Washington. His life story is his life story. You don't have to say he's great, presidents are bad. We need to find stories that the progressive media is ignoring because it doesn't fit their ideology, and tell them frankly, and tell them with both sides.
Yeah.
A lot of the films by our friends only have one side, just like many progressive films have only one side. But we aspire to have both sides and let viewers decide and try to reach the middle.
Let's give you a blank check and a dream scenario, both of you. I feel like there are so many stories not being told, and I could just point to maybe Venezuela and the horrors of socialism and what that government philosophy has done to a once prosperous nation. It's just a tiny example of the stories that could be told and are not being told, or even just small businesses that were shut down by the COVID lockdowns, and have like a man on the street look at their lives, their journey, their hardships. I mean, I just think that cries out for storytellers like yourself. If you were given a blank check tomorrow and you could do a film, what are there certain subjects you're just itching to cover that are being ignored elsewhere?
As you say, it is vast. I think a lot of what happened in COVID needs to be described and talked about in the recent past. In the distant past, I do not feel that Hollywood has told the story of the Cold War properly. The biggest event in my own lifetime, a great success on the part of a bipartisan effort on the part of America. We defeated one of the most totalitarian regimes in human history. Hollywood doesn't exactly celebrate it as it did the victory of World War II. But, so I have to say, Christian, I don't quite have a blank check, but we have a very generous donors who've given us a pool of money, both to develop long-form documentaries, our own short-form documentaries, and the incubator. So at the moment, we're in the end, we're going to need money as we expand. But now we have enough to launch things. We're working on a long-form documentary about the events in Seattle in the summer of 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd protests. You may remember that protesters were, protesting all over the country, sometimes turning violent. Seattle, along with Portland, Minneapolis, and New York, and many others, DC. in Seattle, it had the unique story that the police, for whatever reason, in front of the protesters were protesting in front of this precinct in a fashionable part of Seattle, the Capitol Hill area, and the police left the precinct and let the protesters control a six square block area. And they erected barriers. They called it first Chaz and then Chop. They ran it their own way. And in the end, there were 2 murders and the city had to close it. So we are going to look at how that happened. What does that tell us about America? What does it tell us about that kind of a city? It's a story that was only covered at the time by Fox and conservative media. The progressive media ignored it. And it's an important story to look back on. And we would hear from all sides, including protesters, including peaceful protesters, including non-peaceful protest, less than peaceful protesters, including city officials and everybody. And that's a good example of a story that has a lot to tell us about contemporary America that other media companies are ignoring.
Gosh, that is such a perfect example. And you think that any filmmaker, any documentary filmmaker would be itching to tell it, to share it, to explore it. And I think you'll have it. I think you'll have that space all to yourselves. Before I let you go, a couple last questions. Are there any, I'm going to say young because I'm just describing generically. They could be older artists who are just finding their voice. But is there anyone out there that maybe fits your criteria or that you've just heard about, or just, gosh, I've seen a little bit of their work. Maybe they're just on YouTube, but they're really impressing me. Does anyone jump to mind in that regard that you could call out and give them a little bit of a bigger spotlight?
Maybe, Thomas, where are you in the talent search? We're just starting since the
Sure.
But how's that process going, Thomas?
Well, it's going great. I mean, I think that it's really hard, I think, if you're a filmmaker and you're trying to break through. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a type of thing is appealing to a lot of people, just in the sense of like, I make a short film and it sits on my website, and then what from there? And is there money in this and that type of thing? And I think that one thing that's exciting in this whole conversation is that things are changing. There's new media that's happening on the right that is extremely exciting. There's an investment in documentaries on both sides. Documentaries are having sort of a renaissance on Netflix.
Sure.
And new ones are coming out on places like the Daily Wire. They're getting a lot of attention. So I think people sort of, I think that in this shifting landscape, where the right is coming out with its own new outlets, people are looking harder at what are we consuming, and also the streaming world is booming. There's kind of a lot going on, and people are paying more attention to this type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the technological breakthroughs we've seen, I have a friend who's a filmmaker, and he just showed me a rough cut of his new movie, and it looks beautiful. And to say it was made on a shoestring barely describes how small the budget is, but you've got that going for you. And then you got all these new distribution channels, whether it's YouTube or Rumble or other ways to share and spread the word like locals.com. So it is an exciting time. And I thank you so much, both of you, Michael and Thomas, for not just joining the show, but doing what you're doing, creating culture. And I love the fact that you're reaching across the aisle and not just making it for the choir, because I think we all need to hear these stories. So please go to palladiumpictures.com. You could also follow them on Twitter at Palladium_Pics, Pics. And again, there is that submission form on palladiumpictures.com where young filmmakers, up-and-comers, or maybe even guys in their 60s or gals in their 70s who have a voice, they've been doing it for a while, they want to go to the next level. That's where you start. And thank you so much, both of you. The culture depends on what you're up to, and no pressure at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian. Great to be on your show.
Hope you enjoyed the latest Hollywood in Toto bonus episode. More are definitely on the way. And if you don't mind, please drop by HollywoodInToto.com for the latest right-leaning culture news, and tell a friend. He or she could be on the left, the right, or the middle. I guarantee they're going to read some stories at Hollywood in Toto that they won't see anywhere else. That's a promise. See you next time.